my name's Mila. I'm with Gather Textiles, and today we're filming a video tutorial to go along with our pattern for the Riverbank Scarf. So if you're a newer weaver or new to rigid heddle weaving, we're going to go over how to set up your rigid heddle loom, as well as this scarf. Hopefully you can see in this lighting a bit. It's got some vertical ribbing, which is accomplished by putting multiple warp ends into the same slot on your loom or in your rigid heddle. So today we will go over the basics of how to warp your loom, how to get it set up for weaving, and how to weave the clasped weft technique that allows you to have the solid colors on both sides of your scarf. So for starters, we've got our rigid heddle loom here, and it has been clamped to the table so that it will not move around during the warping process. At the other end of the table, come across, we've got our warping peg. So this will be the distance measured out according to the pattern. So if the pattern says, if it were a 100-inch pattern, you would measure this from the peg all the way to the rod going over your back beam. So we are now ready to get started on attaching the yarn to the loom and measuring out our warp. What we're going to do is we have put the reed in its neutral, or the heddle, sorry, in its neutral position, and I'm going to be tying on an end of yarn to the beam. We know that this pattern is a little over 12 inches in the heddle, so I won't start it right at the edge. I'll start it in maybe 1.5 inches. There we go. So if we have a 15-inch heddle, and we're going to be using about 12 inches for this pattern, I'm going to be starting my first warp end about 1.5 inches from the edge. You can measure that exactly, or we know because this is an 8-dent reed, you can also just count over from the edge as well. I have my reed hook, which is about 1.5 inches in from the edge. Note that it is in a slot, so the long one, not the little hole. And I'm going to take a piece of yarn and pull it through. We've got our cone of yarn just sitting on the ground behind the back of our rigid heddle so that I can easily pull the yarn up. So I'm taking my first loop, I'm gonna walk around the peg and walk back. Very light tension. We're not stretching this tight. It's mostly just to measure out the yarn, not the tension that we're going to apply while beaming. So this loop is now back through the same slot, and if we look around the back of the beam, I'm going to loop the yarn over, and then this is now the loop that's ready to go. If you were warping your rigid heddle for a different pattern, you would just keep doing these loops as you go across slot and slot and slot and slot, skipping the holes. Because this pattern involves cramming the dents, we're actually going to re-go through the same slot with this loop. So I'm going to go back in the same slot, and so I've effectively put 4 warp ends through the same slot. We'll take this around our peg and lock it back. Okay, so now we're ready to move over to the next slot. So we're going to skip the hole and go into the next slot. And this pattern, it's going to be 4 through a slot, and then for the next 5, 1 loop, 1 loop, 1 loop, 1 loop. So I will do that now. And if we look at the beam, you can see each time I go around, this should just be looping itself so that it catches. Move this over, get my loop around the beam, go into the next slot. Going into the next slot again. one more. At this point, I've got a group of 4, and then 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. So group of 4, and then 5 that just went through once. Now it's time to repeat that. So I'm gonna do 4 through the next one, and this will create the next vertical rib on our scarf. So we've got our 4. Now for the next 5, we're back down to going through each one only once. All right, so I have gone through according to the pattern, which is 4 ends through your first slot, and then the next 5 slots are 2 ends, 2 ends, 2 ends, 2 ends, 2 ends. Then another 4, and 2 ends, 2 ends, 2 ends, 2 ends, 2 ends, and another 4. So where you can see the 4 ends, those are making our vertical ribs, and in this pattern you're gonna have 7 ribs of blue. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I have 4 ends through the last one here, and I'm gonna change colors now. So I am just gonna cut my yarn and tie off this end onto the rod. Okay, and we're gonna switch over to our locket color in the same manner. We're going to tie on our end. And since we just had a vertical rib in blue, the next 5 slots are going to be just 2 ends through, once through making a loop with our locket. Note that we have not put yarn in any of the holes. We're skipping them every time. So I'm going through once. Fourth one. And our 5th one. In the 6th one, this is where we're going to put our next rib. So we are going to cram 4 ends into there. So I'm going back through the same one this time. So we've got 4 ends going through that slot. And we'll repeat that one more time. So I'm going to do 5 slots passing through once. And we will double the last one. We are now at the end, so I'm going to tie off that last end there. Okay, so we have gone all the way across our rigid heddle, and we are now ready to beam the warp onto the back beam. If you have a buddy, you can just take this yarn up and one person's rolling and the other person is holding tension. If you're by yourself, what I like to do is to chain the yarn a little bit just until I get closer. So I'm just chaining the warp to give me one solid piece to grab. So once I'm about here, my arm is long enough that I can grab the yarn and start twisting it on. So once our rod is just before it's going to touch itself, we want to sneak in a stick, or at this time you could also wind on some paper if you're using paper as your warp separator. So we just put in one warping stick, and you want to make sure you're getting a stick at least once a rotation, ideally even less than that. So I've gone about 3/4 of the way around, got my next stick. And so our stick should be beyond the edge of the warp. We'll go ahead and roll again about another 3/4 of a rotation. And I'm tucking in my next stick. Make sure it's past the edge. And with my left hand, I'm keeping an even tension. So not like strangling the warp super hard, but you can give it a good grab. And if you notice at any point that there's one piece that's loose and dangling, or one piece feels really, really tight, you should stop and find out why. But our goal here is to keep the warp under tension with one hand while we're twisting the crank with the other hand. So I have wound on the entirety of the warp onto the back beam here, and I'm ready now because there's all of these loops. We'll just give them a trim. So I'm just cutting off the last inch or so that the ends are free. So we can now unclamp our loom. All right, so we have moved our loom to a spot with better lighting, and our next step is to evenly distribute the ends into the holes that we didn't use yet. So our first slot, we put 4 ends in there. We're gonna keep 3 and just move 1 over into this hole. So I'm using my sleigh hook, so now it will go 3 ends through the slot, 1 end through the hole. Now we go to the second slot where we have 2 ends, and we're going to move 1 of those over into the next hole. Because we're working in all blue, it doesn't matter which of the ends you move into the hole. So every slot, there's an extra thread. We're leaving 1 in the slot, moving 1 into the hole. Now we're at the next one that has 4, and same thing, we're going to leave 3 and move 1 over. So we're at the point now where I have moved 1 end from each slot over into the hole. So all of the holes across are now filled. So the pattern for most of the slang was any slot that had 4 ends, we moved 1 over. And so our vertical ribs are going to be 3 warp ends. At the very end, in order to keep an even number of warp ends and make the pattern a little more beginner friendly, we are leaving all 4 ends in the last selvage edge rib. So not to worry, that's not a mistake. We have 4 ends, in the final slot, and we're gonna leave it like that for this pattern. So we're now ready to get the warp ends connected to the front apron rod. To do that, I'm taking sections of about 1 inch. I'm gonna tie a knot just like that. So we have our ends, and then we will connect them to this rod. We'll just check that our distance is reasonable. And I'm gonna take a couple arms lengths worth of either a non-stretchy yarn or a cord, something that's really strong and can handle some tension. And we'll start by tying that to the rod. And then at this point, we want to be consistent. So in my hands, I like to dip through the middle. So I'm doing about half and half of the number of ends. Go through the middle, and I'll go under and over. Then we go around the rod, same thing. Divide it in about half. Grab the cord going under and over. And we'll continue this way all the way across. You don't want any of your knots so close that they can touch the rod. It's less of a concern if the knot is further away, but it means you'll need a longer distance of cord. So we have come to the end, and I'm going to tie this off. And then this guy doesn't need to be quite so long, so. If I were to feel across my warp now, these are not even. This is very loose, this guy's a little tighter. So we can adjust these cords by snugging them in each direction until it feels even. So this guy's a little too loose, so I'll pull that. This is now feeling nice and even across the warp. I'll advance it a little bit, and then we'll be ready to go. We have moved our point of lashing on a little bit forward, so I advanced the warp, and we're ready now to spread the warp out by weaving a header. So I've got some scrap yarn from another project. I've got the heddle in the lowered position, but it doesn't really matter which side you start on. So in the lowered position, I do a pick without beading. I'm going to move it to the upper position and go across. We'll move it again to the lower position. And now these 3 picks we can beat together, and you'll notice that they spread the warp out and greatly close the gaps that were formed between the tie-on points. So I'm going to continue back and forth in this plain weave pattern. I've woven about 2.5 inches using the river blue, and this portion is going to make the sewn hem once we take this off the loom. We're now ready to add our locket color and begin weaving the body of our scarf. I will begin by passing my shuttle through. And I'm going to take the tail, because we're starting a new end, same thing as before. I'm looping it around that outer selvage edge and then going back into my shed and out the back about an inch or so. I can then beat this into place and that end will be secure. Leaving my shed in the same position, we're now going to clasp our weft. So I have the blue yarn off to the side, and all I'm going to do is wrap around it and go back out. This will give me a clasp weft that I can move around to the position I like. For this scarf design, we're aiming to have the clasp position just to the left of our rib. So we want it kind of going over that lone blue strand. So we'll get it into position and keep an eye on it as we beat. And we can switch now to our upper shed and do the same thing. So I'm going to go through with my shuttle. I'm going to loop it around the blue yarn and come back out the same shed. And then I can tighten this up until my clasp sits right under the color junction between the blue and the locket. And then I can beat that in. And then I will switch sheds. This is one of the reasons I have my yarn on this side on a boat shuttle, is it makes it really easy for this to just to roll off. Alternatively, you could leave just your cone here on a cone holder or wind it onto any shuttle of your choice. So I'm going back through, we'll loop around, and in the same shed, going back. Move the clasp to where we want it and beat it into place. So we're weaving along the scarf, and you can see by clasping the weft at the color junction, we're able to have the warp and weft be the same on both sides. As we go, you'll notice that this looks really quite open. We're aiming for about 8 to 10 picks per inch, with the doubling being 2 picks. So this counting as a double, so that's 2. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and that's taken about an inch. So 8 to 10 picks per inch for this scarf is correct. It's going to look open on the loom, and it will feel quite open when you first cut it off the loom. But with wet finishing, all of these gaps are going to close. So the final product will have no gaps, no holes, and it's going to have this really dense, fluffy feel. And part of accomplishing that is to allow it to be a little open on the loom.